hope everybody can hear me. Can you all hear? Okay. I'm guessing somebody will let me know if not, but I wanted to begin by, I think I went too far, talking about the topic today, which is strategies for increasing communication in children with autism. And I think, we all have our own variety of diverse communication, and hopefully this will address multiple different levels of communication deficits and excesses. To begin, when we have typically thought of communication, we have divided it and classified it into by topographies, which we would normally say would be receptive and expressive language. I'm going to show you that there's another way to classify our communication other than topography, but the topography classification system of receptive and expressive, basically receptive is understanding and identification, and expressive is the output of the language and the communicating to an individual versus being the receiver. And when you're using expressive language, there's many different ways that you can teach or have expressive language. It can be vocal, but it can also be using sign language. We also use picture exchange systems. We use different augmentative communication systems, and those involve selection systems, sign language, and even more high-tech devices these days, such as, we're using iPads, and we've really progressed through with our technology recently. Some of the issues that we've come up with, though, with some of these different types of communication is that when we focus on, let's say, sign language, it doesn't require a lot of discrimination, and there's not a lot of carrying things with you, but everyone doesn't fully understand sign language, so it's not as, it's not as helpful and cannot be used everywhere with anyone, and so it's not usually for that purposes. That might be the downfall. You can develop a full repertoire, though, of communication with sign language, very complex language, although we haven't quite seen that acquisition as much in our children with autism as we have with the deaf community. And but with selection systems, you can actually see adults learn to talk. Comes with that. It's kind of a byproduct, and there's not really special training that's needed for anyone who's listening or receiving the information from the individual like there is with sign language, so it's very universal. The issues, though, with selection systems is that many times that complex language is slowed. So really, more than just your basic communication, it's very difficult. And you also usually have to take some sort of system to carry with you. There's more discrimination that's needed, and there's just different levels of, vocal and language that we haven't quite figured out the best way to teach and hasn't been researched enough. But the main advice that we usually give is that we want you to pick one and use it consistently. And I think that's really hard for a lot of us as parents and even teachers, that we tend to think, oh, well, they can do this with this, and they can say this with this, and we start trying to combine all these different, and we want to give them all the options available, but that can actually be confusing, and they can come to a point where they just don't quite know when to do what, and so the child can end up actually decreasing their language through it. So it's really important to pick one that's appropriate and use that consistently. And once you do that, you will actually see a reduction in your problem behavior as well with the increase in communication. Now, another way that we, I'm trying to move this out of the way, I hope. Another way that we can classify our language is behaviorally. And so when we classify language behaviorally, it's based upon the behavior analysis of verbal behavior. And so this was something that it's just, language is a behavior. And so we can use the science of behavior to teach it and change it and modify it. So the same way that everything other behavior is learned, so is language. And But in the behavioral-based language, we classify it by the function, just as we do any other behavior in the behavioral world. Rather than classifying it by receptive or expressive, it's going to be what the function of that language is. So it becomes more than just your speaker and your listener. Some of the examples are Mands, which are short for demand or command, and that's basically a request. And we've got tacting, which is basically labeling. Intraverbals, where there's an exchange of communication of some sort. And then there is echoic, where you're actually echoing somebody else or something else. Imitation, so with sign language, if somebody does a sign and you imitate it. Textual, writing a letter. That's our textual, that's a, and then we've got copying a text and transcription. I mentioned that the Mands earlier, which is something that functions as a request. This is something that the function actually produces an immediate benefit to your learner. And because of that, the natural reinforcement is built into that target behavior that they're providing. So this is the best way to start your language teaching, is with Mands, teaching Manding, because it's going to teach a child that verbal behavior is actually valuable, that there's a reason for it. Socially, if they have social deficits and that's not motivating to them, you're most likely not going to see just talking for the sake of talking to interact with somebody as being motivating and beneficial. But when it's a request for something they want, it is going to be beneficial. And so once we see that it's valuable, then we're able to, teach them other repertoires to say, after they want to talk. And this ends up actually replacing problem behaviors. So a lot of problem behaviors are actually functioning as manding, as requesting. So they've learned by doing this behavior, this happens. And so they've learned that's how they get their needs met. And so it's actually functioning as a request. So when they don't have a more appropriate expressive manner of requesting, you see more problem behaviors. Language, the first repertoire actually learned by any individual is usually a Mand. It's because it makes things happen. It's actually essential for the development of many other language functions. And once the child wants to talk, we teach them what to say. So we've got to have that motivation there. Language is broad. When I talk about language, I'm referring to vocalization, sign language, gestures, anything of that sort. Another thing is that a Mand is social. So it's directed at another individual and in order for it to operate, which is different than just doing something and getting something their own independent ways. And so a lot of times we want to work on independence because that's a great skill and we want to increase that. But sometimes, and it's very common actually in our kids with autism, we tend to see them as many times very independent of getting things that they need, getting their needs met. And the downfall of that is that they're not actually social. They're doing it all themselves and we think it's really great and we let them do it, but we're not opening up those opportunities for social interaction and seeing the motivation in that. So children will learn to Mand in the presence of others, because if you think about it, if no one's around when a child requests something, like let's say something's out of reach or in the refrigerator and they are requesting, they're saying, I want milk, and nobody's there, then the item won't be attained. And so it's not going to reinforce that behavior and they're going to stop saying that, whatever that is that they're requesting. So it definitely is the way they learn to Mand is in the presence of other people. So when we're talking about Manding, just a little bit with that reinforcement, you want to make sure what you're doing when you're teaching Manding is you want to have the right reinforcement. You want to have desired items. That's something that many people Mand for. Another thing that people Mand for is information. And the reinforcement is the information that they're given. So when you ask a question for information, where is the restroom? The answer of it's in hall A hall gives you what you're needing. And so that's reinforcing. Manding for assistance, when you ask for help, when you're gaining that assistance in something, once you get that assistance, it's reinforced. And then sometimes Manding is to remove an aversion. So let's say somebody asks you to be quiet. They're demanding to remove the voice level. That's, removing an aversion. Or if somebody asks you to move, they're requesting that in order to get whatever it is that's in their way out of the way. So as I said, it's motivation. If you've ever heard, the MO, the motivating operation, we all use the term a lot. Oh, that's his MO, that's her MO, my MO. Well, it's your motivating operation. That's what gets you motivated to do it. That's what you do. That's what, as you've been your behavior's maintained. So a motivating operation, an MO, is something that basically is going to temporarily alter the value of things, and such as the reinforcement. So for example, not having chocolate for weeks, and you love chocolate. It becomes deprived. So now your motivating operation is high, and it makes chocolate more valuable. So you would do more to get the chocolate. And so the MO is going to evoke behaviors that brought those reinforcers prior. Then another function of our language is tacting. And this is the behavior of labeling something, and it's actually a social function of attention. So when we talk about, behaviors being attention maintained or escape maintained, well, tacting, that is maintained by attention, because you label something so that somebody would respond to you. We don't normally label something when we're by ourselves. So again, it's a social nature. And when we're teaching tacting, you want to begin in fun, highly motivated settings, things that are going to grab the person's interest, because they're going to be more motivated to talk about it. Just like we have our children that have their obsessions and their high interests, and they can talk about it all the time. Same thing with our students that are just beginning to talk, and labeling is what we're working on, tacting, then we want to do it with something that they're highly motivated by. So when a student's attention is drawn to something, a great something to do for language there in order to increase the tacting is model the label. Model what it is. And you're going to, work on them being able to do that. And, your typical kid you see is always like, oh, there's this, there's that, I see this, mommy, mommy. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about tacting and labeling. And you can just, follow up a tact or a label. You say, they look at something, they're drawing their attention to something, and you go over and you say, oh, this is a ball. And you then say, yes, it's a ball. And you start by really being around it and having fun and making it positive. The next more complex function of language is an intraverbal. And here it's where, the behavior is in response to language of others. So it involves even higher complex social interactions, and what's going to stimulate the language, what's going to be the cue for it, is somebody else's language. So it involves two people, a back and forth. An example of this is asking questions. So when asking a question, you might be manding, but it's also an intraverbal if the other person is there and is a part of the interaction. Okay, so let's begin to talk about some basic general strategies for language acquisition at really any level. The first thing, which is kind of contrary to your typical what you would think, is that you want to minimize your questions. And I know that sounds opposite, because you want to be teaching and learning and bringing up all these different things, and you think it's going to bring about more language. But especially in the initial stages of language, if they don't understand what a question is, and they aren't asking questions, and they're not answering questions, then by asking a lot of questions without getting answers, we're really just not teaching them the difference in a question and a comment. And so in actuality, when we do want to teach the questions, it's going to be that much harder. So really, minimizing the questions in the attempt to truly tune into the important variables of that type of language and what makes it that function. another strategy for language acquisition is commenting. So with commenting, tons of commenting. There's never too much commenting. You know, I would keep it simple and basic for our early learners, not complex, you know, sentences, but just commenting all the time on everything. Constant comments, comments, comments. On what you see, on what you're doing, on what you hear. Even if they're not responding, even if they're not looking and you think they're just not taking it in, why would I do it? Just continue to do it. A strategy that we'll get into a little bit is weighting and signaling. So you're basically going to learn to signal your child to communicate by weighting them out and not always making it happen and prompting them. We give something what we call expectant looks. So we're ready for the student has said something in the past, and instead of saying, remember, Johnny, you need to say hi, at that point we can give this look, like with your eyebrows raised and your eyes wide open, and it tells them, oh yeah, I remember now, I'm supposed to say hi. And then the other thing, which is really, really important, is arranging communicative situations. So we can't just, it's very tempting to expect every need that our child has, and we see them doing something, oh, you want this? Okay, let me go get this. Oh, you need to go potty, like your typical kid. You see them jumping up and down doing the potty dance, and we immediately are like, oh, I think you need to go potty. Do you need to go potty? And that's not really arranging for them to speak. And so they don't have to, and they learn they don't have to, and they just become dependent. And then you don't see the increase. Using abundant gestures and facial expressions. You know, as therapists, we tend to get a lot of practice of this, and it's really important. But really, same thing, think about when somebody's talking to you, and it's like, you can tell when they're really into you and when they're just kind of there. That's what we end up doing when we're not giving that abundant gestures and facial expressions. And especially for our children on the spectrum that are having difficulty discriminating in those tiny differences in feelings and facial emotions, if we make them more abundant and more exaggerated, then we're going to get a better response. Doing a lot of modeling and prompting, but when modeling, like I said before, really simple. Make it brief. Same with exaggerating your facial expressions and gestures. You also want to exaggerate that tone and volume. Really, the rate, really increase it, and to really point out and stress and emphasize what's going on there. Never forgetting about positive reinforcement, for sure. Sometimes it's really important to just talk to your child on their physical level too. So not necessarily getting down on their level and right at their face would help. Frequent opportunities means all day in all environments, just constantly arranging multiple opportunities. And that's, some of that natural environment teaching, which is known to be best for generalization and maintenance, and getting out of that, oh, here's my therapy session, discrete trial type of format. And errorless learning involves breaking skills down, and that's for sure important in any program, especially language. So something that we tend to do initially to increase our language, and this is for those learners who babble infrequently. They have very few different sounds. It's like the kid that says 2 or 3 same sounds all the time if they say anything at all. What we're going to do is we're going to use automatic reinforcement. And basically our goal here is that we just want to increase the sounds they're making and get it more frequent and get it all the time so that we have more to work with in shaping language. So that's going to help us to acquire that language behavior in the vocals in the repertoire, or the signs or anything like that. One important thing to do is engage in preferred activities. You're going to get any more sounds and more vocalizations when you're doing something that they like. And anything that you're going to be using for requesting, when you're teaching requesting, you don't want to be using as the reinforcers for your automatic reinforcement procedures. And basically, the way that we do this is that we are going to be reinforcing with whatever it is that we're using, which is many times typically an edible or something really small and quick. We're going to be constantly delivering that every sound, every time a sound is made, with praise and imitating the sound. And so over time, they start to learn, oh, when I make a sound, I get rewarded. And so that's how you're going to get to more variety in a minute. So you can start with just increasing it, and then you can, increase the variation. When the child does have certain sounds that they're making spontaneously, find preferred items that begin with that same sound. So if the kid says buh, I might find, oh, you know what, they like bubbles, or they like balloons, and I would want to deliver that item when they make the sound. So then, instead of just imitating the sound, I can model the name of the item. And so we're going to slowly, gradually take that sound, and we're going to be showing them how that relates to, and we're going to be building into using that sound for those items. So it start to get to, rather than just makes b, buh, buh, buh sounds all day, now it's like when he has the ball, you hear buh, 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 buh. And you really always want to model that target sound repeatedly and constantly reinforce. Expansions and elaborations. This is another technique that we use in increasing language, and it is actually a natural environment teaching technique, and it's something that you can do anywhere, anytime, all the time, which is why it's great. And it's increasing the language at any level. So whatever level your child's at, they're going to be able to move up to another level, the next level of complexity or communication, by expanding on what they're saying and then elaborating on it. The expansion is when a child will say something and you will repeat what they say but add to it. So this can happen at many different levels. For example, if a child says buh when they want the ball, and you say ball and you give them the ball, that's expanding on the buh. Now, I'm not making them say, at this point, I'm not going to make them say ball because they can't, but I'm going to expand on the buh. If I just go, that's right, buh, buh, and I give them the ball, then they're going to always think that it's buh. But if I give it the ball and I say ball, then I'm expanding on their buh sound. When you're doing these expansions, the next step in an expansion is that you want to start to have them try to imitate it. So after you started to really expand a lot and frequently, you're going to now start and do a wait and signal for them to imitate. So the kid says buh, and I say ball. Well, the next time, maybe after they've been doing it for a while, the kid says buh, and I'm going to look at them, and I'm going to give them this look like, there's a little more I want you to do, like keep going, and hopefully they will try to say ball. Now, it doesn't matter if they say it right, but if they attempt, you are rewarding and reinforcing, and you want to reinforce with access to whatever that is, if it's a mand for something. But it could just be that it's not even a mand. Maybe the child is late, sees a tree, and they say, t, 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 and so you expand with tree, tree, and so maybe after you've been doing that for a while, they say t, t, and you look at them, and you're giving them this look like, what else do you say? And they might go, ta, trying to say tree. And that's an they've now imitated your expansion. And another level might be that somebody actually says, maybe a child says a word, and they say ball when they want ball. Your expansion could be want ball. You're adding a word. And then you would start to get them to repeat that and imitate that, so that we can get to where they're doing it on their own. If it might be that they say, I want a ball, and you expand with, I want blue ball. So you're constantly expanding. Another expansion that's interesting that people don't realize is when you're working with articulation. So maybe the child says, ba, ba for ball, and you expand with ball. So you're clearing up the articulation. Now, that's the expansion, but the part that's the elaboration is when you're that waiting and signal for the, well, when you do the expansion initially, you're following the child's lead. So you're not really like setting it up as much as, you might be setting it up, but you're capturing it. You're not really initiating it. Your signal to do an expansion is that the child has initiated it. They've said something first. But the elaboration part is now where, okay, so the child said something and they learned to imitate my expansion. Well, now I don't want them to go through this whole process of I'm saying an expansion and they're imitating it. I'm sure they would also prefer to just be like, you know, get access to whatever it is they want faster, or to stop going through this whole system of step by step. It's a lot of talking. So what we do is we're going to take that imitation and we're going to start to omit the expansion. So the child says "buh" for ball, and instead of modeling ball, we're just going to give them that expectant look and to kind of let them know, not "buh," what else, you know, but without saying anything. And then they'll remember, oh yeah, because you don't do this until they're consistently imitating your expansion. So once they're consistently imitating it, then you step to this level because you know they can actually physically do it. And so you're basically fading out your model and your prompt. And if they do it, great, and then you reward and reinforce. If they don't, then you want to prompt what it was and make sure that they still follow through with that versus just leaving it where it was. So here's a little visual of what, for those of you that are visual learners, because I know I am, you've got your child's vocal, that's your spontaneous vocal, they said car, and then you go to your expansion, want car, and I saw that by my data, wow, every time I expanded with want car, they imitated, and I've got like 5 times. All right, well, you know what? I'm going to move on to elaborating. I'm going to give them that look. And look, now all those times they actually did it when I just gave them the look. And then finally you have spontaneous. So now what happens is the student doesn't really want to go through all this. This is a lot. And if you consistently do this, when they can actually do it, they're going to want to skip all that. And so they start to say want car instead of car off just initially on their own. And that's the spontaneous part. So when we are man training, one of the things that we do, you know, we can do man training, which is training those requests, which is that first, you know, function of language that we want to teach. We can use sign language, we can use PECS, we can use vocal language. Some of the prerequisites, though, for the different things, if you're going to use sign language, you want to have good fine motor skills, and you want to be able to imitate motor, have the child have a motor imitation repertoire. For vocal language, you want to be able to have vocal imitation repertoire, or at least attempting to, or else you don't want to go into that topography. And then with PECS, the exchange type systems, a big important part is that they have object-picture correspondence. The best thing would probably be to start, when you're starting to work on Manding, is to come up with a list by settings of the day. So, you know, okay, in the morning, here are some different things that we can work on requesting. And then at playtime, here's some things we can work on requesting. And try to get hundreds of opportunities in a day, actually. So when we are doing man training and vocal, I'm just going to use vocal right now, even though you can do the same steps with the sign language and the PECS. I'm going to use vocalizations as my sample. When it's for items, you want this to be occurring all day. And you want to make it involving items that the child really knows how to make the sounds already, or sounds that are easy sounds to start teaching. Doing it all day is going to give them that motivation because it's on their schedule, not on your schedule. So you're going to just constantly do it on their schedule, following their lead all day. It's really important when we do man training, though, that we do preference assessments, because if it's not motivating, if it's not reinforcing, you're not going to get the behavior, and we're losing the function of the Mand. And this is constantly going to involve shaping procedures to constantly be getting closer and closer, reinforcing closer and closer to what we're really wanting out of them. So here's our how-to. Our first step is we contrive opportunities. We either set them up or we are capturing them. And what this is going to do is this is going to build momentum of that reinforcer. It's going to really get it going. You want to hold up highly reinforcing items and have them, you know, objects of interest to the student. If they're in reach of the child, most likely that independence is going to come in and they're going to just pick up the item, and then you're going to be like, oh, I lost that opportunity. Or they pick it up and I see a lot of people, oh, whoa, wait, I want you to request that. And so they take it back. Well, that's just going to make the child mad. And so you're not really going to get the motivation then to request. So you've got to arrange the environment so that things are out of reach. Things are not in reach of the child, and they have to actually communicate to you to request it. One way that we do this is also giving small portions of things so that they're going to want more. Because if I gave my child a bag of snack and said, okay, go sit down and eat your snack, well, there's no reason to request. And so you see that a lot in schools, especially. They're like, oh, we're going to work on requesting at snack time. But they have all the snack on the plate, and they're like, holding it up in the air and wanting them to request it. It has to be in the teacher's possession if we're going to really get that. Capturing and contriving opportunities involves making choices, the student being able to choose, make a lot of choices. Sometimes it's interrupting interesting activities. So maybe something the child's really enjoying, like sometimes a social activity, like I'm spinning a child, and I spin them once or twice, and then I stop. So that I've had this activity going, and I'm going to briefly stop this activity that they love, because if they love it that much and it's stopped, guess what they're going to want to do? Something to get it to occur again. Sometimes you can even have manding to remove aversions, and the way you would do that is by arranging non-preferred things, right? Only giving a few items at a time, so maybe I'm coloring with a child, and rather than giving them the whole box of crayons and saying, to sit down and color, because then there's no reason to communicate other than social. But if I'm working on manding, because that's where they're at, their level is at, and I want to get that, see the importance of the language and the communication, then if I give them one crayon and the rest are in my hands, then they're going to, when they want a new crayon, they're going to have to communicate and ask me. Sometimes it's capturing an opportunity is pretending that you forgot about their nonverbal communication, and that's that not expecting. So when you see them doing the potty dance, it's like, okay, I know that means they have to go to the bathroom, but I'm going to pretend like I forgot that because I want them to request to go. Or same thing with, I know that when they're standing at the fridge, that means that they're thirsty. Well, rather than me coming over and being like, oh, you're thirsty, you want a drink, I'm going to pretend like I forgot what that means so that they have to. But really the biggest one, which is dependent on the child, is watching for their initiations. So it's their interest is the lead, it's the guide. So for example, teacher holds up the bubbles and says bubble, and the student says buh, and you immediately blow some bubbles. Well, that's a prompted request, a mand. Or hold up the bubbles and you say bubble, and the student says buh, and then you expand with bubbles, and the student says ba, and you can immediately blow the bubbles. So see, you have the bubbles in your hand. That's an opportunity because you're in control of it. So the second part is that withholding the desired object. So it's out of reach now, and you've given partial pieces, and you've created this opportunity. Well, now you've got to withhold it, the item, the object, so that they have to talk. And they're going to vocally model the name of the item or do the sign, but remember we're talking using vocal mands right now. And it's basically, the antecedent is going to be that the child's interest. They're approaching something. They are like, I have the example here, holds up arms to be tickled. You see that a lot, or holding up arms for you to pick them up. Well, rather than just picking them up because their arms went up, we're going to actually have that opportunity now to work on the vocal. So don't say, tell me what you want, because now what happens is if you do that, then the child is going to become dependent on you saying, tell me what you want. That's what they're waiting for, not the item, not seeing you and wanting to get in your arms as the signal. So if you just model the actual words that you want them to say in a given situation, then you can fade that model out, and then they're basically, the signal is they see whatever it is and they say the words. So you would just, the boy approaches and holds his arms up, and you would say, I want tickle, not tell me what you want or what do you want. When you know it, just model it and fade out your model. Adding those other directives also distracts the child, and the child ends up imitating the whole thing you're saying. So sometimes if you say, tell me what you want, you start to hear those echolalic children, tell me what you want, tickle, and that's what they say. So next time your daughter picks up an empty cup and hands it to you, you don't say, do you want a drink? Just say, drink, and then have them imitate it. Or like a boy is looking out the window, just an example of, you know, the bus coming and he's jumping and excited because he's going to be, you know, going home from school. You don't want to say, it's time to go home, here's the bus, can you say bus? You just, when he gets excited, you model, I want to go home. So that next time he's excited, he's going to say, I want to go home. Okay, then the third step is after the child makes any vocal sound following your model, you're going to give access to that item immediately, and you're going to praise them. That praise and that access to the item is one of the most important parts of the Mand. If after 2 to 3 seconds there's no attempt by the student, then you want to repeat your model again, and you keep doing that in 2 to 5 second intervals repeatedly until they do. If, you know, the student says "buh" for bubbles, and then you blow the bubbles and you say "bubble," then the teacher holds up the bubbles and you say "bubble," and the student says "buh." You go "bubbles," and the student says "buh-buh." You blow the bubbles. But let's say the student didn't give a response after that prompt, and you did it. Then after 3 seconds, you'll say "bubble" again, and they'll go "bubble," and then you'll blow the bubbles. You also want to work on fading out your model. So the next step is to fade your prompts. So at this point, this is not when, you know, that you hold up the bubbles and you don't say bubbles for them to model it. You hold up the bubbles and you're waiting. You're giving them this look. You're kind of that expectant look that we did on the elaborations. That's what you're doing here. You're giving that look and you're fading out your model as your prompt for the Mand. And you're going to shape, at this point, your child's request with lots of trials. You'll keep fading out that prompt. The next step of fading, once you've faded out your prompt, and now all you do is you have that item there and they immediately request it, now you can start to fade out the item, because that's a whole other level of the skill, is them requesting something when it's not present. And so it might be you start with the item on the table, and you're going to get to where the item is finally behind your back, and then you're going to get to where the item is not in presence at all. Okay? Now, with sign language, it's very similar. Same similar thing, it's just going to be slightly different. You're still going to use your highly preferred items from your preference assessments. And the child should already be familiar, you know, with the signs for the item. That would be ideal. But, you know, you're going to put your highly preferred item on a table and state the name of the item, but immediately after you state the name of the item, you're going to prompt the correct sign. Instead of prompting the vocal, you're prompting the sign, and then you're delivering the item. And you continue to do that in the same way as you did with the vocals, but you're fading out your physical model or visual model rather than fading out your vocal model. If the student gives an incorrect sign when they're manding with sign, you always want to make sure that you help them place their hands back down to neutral for a couple seconds and then guide the correct sign before delivering the item. Because you don't want them to start to get into a thing where they start to scroll through lots of different signs. And so if you put your hands down, it's like restarting it. Okay, so some of the reasons, actually I meant to say this, some of the reasons that sign language might not succeed, which is something to think about, is if you didn't start with Mands. So a lot of people I hear say, oh, my child didn't do very well with sign language, never got signs, it didn't work. Maybe a lot of times I see they didn't start with manding. Or they'll sometimes start with complex abstract Mands, like the yes, no, or the more, or the help. And what those things are is those, yes, it's good in the sense of getting needs met immediately because it's so broad and general, but it's also so broad and general that it becomes useful so much that you don't end up seeing a lot of progression, because that ends up working and it's easiest. You also want to make sure that when you're doing sign language that the first signs that you're teaching are very different from each other, so there's not some confusion. You want to make sure you have enough repetition of trials, and fading your prompts out so that your child does not become prompt dependent is really important. When you're using spontaneous manding, that's when now you can bring in that expansions and elaborations. So now that your child is not needing to learn to mand, they're manding. Now you might be teaching new mands in that same way, but the ones that they already know, you can start expanding on. And so those you can start to, when they mand, you're going to model better articulation or adding words to the sentence of the request, and use that procedure that we went over for expansions and elaborations. Real briefly, mand training with PECS, very similar. You have your physical exchange in phase 1. Phase 2, you have your expanding the spontaneity. Then you start to bring in your phase 3 where you're actually discriminating different items. So a lot of people make that mistake and they right off the bat try to teach PECS and they have all these things out and they're trying to like discriminate where they haven't really taught the system yet. So with the physical exchange, you want to have your preferred item presented, and you're going to be sitting behind the student, a trainer, somebody is, and they're physically prompting the child to exchange the picture for the item that's out there. And you fade your prompts until they're independently exchanging the picture for the item on the table. The spontaneity is expanded by moving the exchange person further and further. So now the picture of whatever it is that they're exchanging is maybe on the book cover of the communication book, and the person they're exchanging it with is gradually moving further and further away versus sitting right there. And the student is then prompted by that trainer behind them to get the picture and go to the person to exchange for the item. And again, you fade your prompts until they're doing this independently. Then once they're doing it all the way through that with one item, that's when you start to teach the discrimination of that selection, where the student is taught to select and exchange pictures from an array of pictures in a book. But you want to teach it with one thing initially. And then phase 4 is when you start to build sentence structure in your requests, where the student's starting to combine an I want card with a card of the desired item. And then seeks the partner and gives the sentence strip to that exchange partner. Whoever is the exchange partner definitely needs to read the strip back and praise for the independent labeling. And then the 5th phase is what do you want, where the student's actually responding to a question, which is more like an intraverbal that we were talking about before. So some of the rules that we want to keep in mind, this is really important just across the board, is that you really have to do all of this training in natural environment. If you do this only in discrete trials at a table, one-on-one, you are going to see use of it in certain times and not at other times, which isn't really fluent communication. So teach in the natural environment using and that involves more of the motivation for the student because it's following their lead, and using what's motivating at the time. Capturing and contriving opportunities multiple times, very important. I would say as a rule of thumb, 3 mands per minute is what you're looking to do. You want with your non-vocal children, you want them to start with their highest reinforcers. So if they're not vocal and you're starting the very beginning of their language of manding, start with those highest reinforcers. And if they're vocal and they already have tons of vocalization, then you don't have to start with a target reinforcer. You can just throughout the day in every way work on setting up those opportunities, because a lot of children aren't vocal. They have all the language, they just don't use it. Those are the kids that you're just constantly setting up these opportunities, where the ones that don't have the language, you're just starting it out of getting even the ability to make vocalizations. Those are the ones that you have to actually target a specific item to start with. Really important that when you're doing this, though, that you put problem behavior on extinction. You cannot let the problem behavior be effective in getting their needs met. This is in substitution for that. Practice all the time, and really having that consistency in your method so that everyone knows what you're doing and how to do it, so that the student is constantly getting that practice. And another important thing that people forget is, even though I sit here and I say, do it all day, practice all the time, you also got to give some freebies. Otherwise, they know that every single time they want something, they're going to have to work at it. It can decrease their ability, their desire. And then your reinforcers are not as motivating. So that's basically avoiding that you have to talk to get this. Like, you don't want to say that anymore. You're taking that out. And you're just actually prompting these Mands. So that comes to the end of our strategies. I hope that was helpful. I will go and check. I'll take a minute, if you don't mind, for me to check and see if there's any questions, and I will be back. Okay, so I was able to take a look at some questions, and I'd like to answer a few of them. Somebody has asked, how would you interact with an autistic child who wants something and they ask for it repeatedly, even after given an answer of yes or no? Great question. And, you know, I do get into this in some other presentations, but I will briefly address on it that that's actually a really good thing. That means that they are starting to really see the value in manding, and you have gotten that behavior in the repertoire. So that's very, very good. But your next step is that it's not really the manding at this point that you're working on. What you're working on there is a different behavior, and that's the behavior of accepting no. And so at that point, what you're going to try to do is, we call this nagging. The child's now nagging because it's that repetitive constantly, which it means it's in the repertoire. But the way that you do that is you're going to start to fade to only intermittently reinforcing at this point. So once they're nagging all the time, you're going to only start to reinforce by giving access every other time, or, you know, every 2 times. But the other thing is, if you've said no, then the constant asking and manding is their way of basically not accepting that you said no. So the best thing to do with that is to start when you say no, and instead of just saying no, say no, but you can do ABC or XYZ. And so you give an alternative that's preferred but maybe not the same. And if they throw a tantrum or they continue to nag, you've got to walk away and ignore that behavior and put that on extinction. That's what I meant by extinguishing the problem behavior that I mentioned earlier when manding. And if they, if they accept the item or the alternative activity or whatever without getting upset and without continuously nagging, then you can reward them for that as well. Somebody else asked, I have a 4-year-old boy who is starting to babble some sounds. Do you think it's better to concentrate on the automatic reinforcement during 1 hour a day on a free overstimulated environment, or give him short stimulations during all day? I would say that the best thing would be to use short little sessions throughout your day, because then what they are doing is they're seeing that it's not limited to one specific little period of time. And so you're going to see more generalization, and you're going to see what you're wanting to see, where those sounds are happening all day. But you want to keep it still short sessions because you don't want to satiate them and the motivation is gone. And also you don't want them to constantly feel like they're working at this point that hard, because this is that beginning stages and you want it to be positive. And then third, somebody asked, what about kids that have severe apraxia? You can see them trying to say the word, but there's such a disconnect between brain and mouth. And you're right, the apraxia is still a mystery to so many people. There is not an answer for it. It's a matter of knowing the individual child and, try again. I know that some of the things that I've suggest is taking approximations. You really can't work on the perfection so much. It's a matter of accepting whatever their reinforcing attempts. It's also a matter of maybe finding another output. Maybe the vocal output is not their best way. Maybe the iPad is best. Maybe the sign language is best, depending on their strength in fine motor and object-picture correspondence. So it's really finding the right venue. And I have actually known a lot of people that have found success with apraxia when they've used the prompt method. It's something that I'm not an expert in. It's not my field, but I know it's something that certain speech and language pathologists use. And I have seen it very effective in students with apraxia as well. So hopefully that has helped, and that you were able to take something from this. I appreciate you attending. I'm not sure if anyone is still here, but I know that I just got some more questions sent to me, so I'd be happy to answer some of them. So I'll go ahead and answer them, and if you're not here, you're not here. But somebody said, for a child that's verbal and knows how to answer questions, how do I teach him to ask them himself? He does some basic asking, but not all the time. That is going to involve that looking for cues that the question is needed, or times when they would normally ask questions, or something that makes you know that they don't know something, and modeling it and fading out your model. When somebody asked about how can you help someone to express, you know, feel more emotions and feelings like hungry and sick and cold, and to be honest, that is going to be the same thing. It's going to be looking for those signs and cues, and really doing more of that. You've got to read what's going on to know when to prompt it, and then being able to fade out your prompts. Talk about how to motivate a very stubborn child who is nonverbal and will just walk away if you withhold a desired item. And I would say that that means that you might need to go back to some of these beginnings, like the automatic reinforcement, or just having them make a sound in order to get the item. But if they're not even going to make a sound to get the item, then it would be, you could even start with just requiring eye contact to get the item. But it, you know, that means that you're really kind of expecting probably too much. It's too much work, too much effort for the motivation of the item. The other option is that the items aren't reinforcing enough. And so you need to spend more time intensively practicing with things that are highly, highly motivating and keeping them away at all other times so that they're really, really strong. Many times we have certain reinforcers that we use just for manding. And it's like you can't have these things at any other time, because we want them to be really, really motivating and worthwhile for them to talk to get them. Somebody asked how many times you should press your son to mimic the mand, and if he does not, do I refuse the item? It kind of depends on what your child can do. If you're trying to have them model, you know, repeat your mand that they really physically can't do, then you would want to reduce your requirement of what you're expecting out of them. But if it is something they can do, then it would be a matter, you would definitely want to refuse the item and not give it to them, because if they know they can get the item regardless, then they're not going to work for it. Somebody asked about RPM, and that's that rapid prompt method that I was talking about for listening communication, and I think I did end up giving my thoughts on that. Somebody asked about a bilingual home. If your child is non-vocal, and I really, really recommend only using one language at home. It's just too much, and they end up giving up and doing nothing, because they can't. I mean, they're non-vocal as it is. So for them to hear a mix of languages, they don't know how to even process that. So for that, I mean, I know it's not what we usually prefer in a home. We want to, you know, when we have a bilingual home, we want to use our language and our native language, and we want our children to be bilingual. But if this is your priority, is your non-vocal child speaking, then that would really be important to do. Somebody else asked about the wanting somebody that's using PECS to do more than just the picture exchange, and meaning they want them to start vocalizing more. And that actually should be happening. The vocals many times can come along with PECS. What you want to do is you first want to be modeling the vocal with the picture exchange, if you're not doing that already. But if you're constantly modeling the vocals with the exchange of the pictures, then I would start to have him repeat your model. So, you know, they have they gave you the picture and you said ball, then I would have them try to repeat and imitate the vocal as well. And I would just let whatever sound comes out, you want to reinforce any approximation, any attempt. I think that's it. So hope that helped. Thanks, everybody.